Secrets, Lies, and Democracy. Book by Noam Chomsky. Audiobook by the Learner's Library. Part 2. Index. 2. The World. A. Toward Greater Inequality. B. Free Trade. C. Mexico and South Central LA. D. Haiti. E. Nicaragua. F. China. G. Russia. H. Dead children and debt service. 3. Historical background. A. How the Nazis won the war. B. Chile. C. Cambodia. D. World War II POWs. 4. Miscellaneous topics. A. Consumption versus well-being. B. Cooperative enterprises. C. The coming eco-catastrophe. D. Nuclear power. E. The family. 5. What you can do. The World, Toward Greater Inequality. In his column in the New York Times, Anthony Lewis wrote, "Since World War II, the world has experienced extraordinary growth." Meanwhile, at a meeting in Quito, Ecuador, Juan de Diaz-Para, the head of the Latin American Association for Human Rights, said, "In Latin America today, there are 7 million more hungry people, 30 million more illiterate people, 10 million more families without homes, 40 million more unemployed persons than there were 20 years ago. There are 240 million human beings in Latin America without the necessities of life, and this when the region is richer and more stable than ever, according to the way the world sees it." How do you reconcile those two statements? It just depends on which people you're talking about. The World Bank came out with a study on Latin America which warned that Latin America was facing chaos because of the extraordinarily high level of inequality, which is the highest in the world, and that's after a period of substantial growth. Even the things the World Bank cares about are threatened. The inequality didn't just come from the heavens. There was a struggle over the course of Latin American development back in the mid-1940s, when the New World Order of that day was being crafted. Toward Greater Inequality, the State Department documents on this are quite interesting. They said that Latin America was swept by what they called the philosophy of the new nationalism, which called for increasing production for domestic needs and reducing inequality. The basic principle of this new nationalism was that the people of the country should be the prime beneficiary of the country's resources. The U.S. was sharply opposed to that and came out with an economic charter for the Americas that called for eliminating economic nationalism, as it's also called, in all of its forms, and insisting that Latin American development be complementary to U.S. development. That means we'll have the advanced industry and the technology, and the peons in Latin America will produce export crops and do some simple operations that they can manage. But they won't develop economically the way we did. Given the distribution of power, the U.S. of course won. In countries like Brazil, we just took over. Brazil has been almost completely directed by American technocrats for about 50 years. Its enormous resources should make it one of the richest countries in the world, and it's had one of the highest growth rates. But thanks to our influence on Brazil's social and economic system, it's ranked around Albania and Paraguay in quality of life measures, infant mortality, and so on. It's true, as Lewis says, that there's been very substantial growth in the world. At the same time, there's incredible poverty and misery, and that's increased even more. If you compare the percentage of world income held by the richest 20% and the poorest 20%, the gap has dramatically increased over the past 30 years. Comparing rich countries to poor countries, it's about doubled. Comparing rich people to poor people within countries, it's increased far more and is much sharper. That's the consequence of a particular kind of growth. Do you think this trend of growth rates and poverty rates increasing simultaneously will continue? Actually, growth rates have been slowing down a lot. In the past 20 years, they've been roughly half of what they were in the preceding 20 years. This tendency toward lower growth will probably continue. One cause is the enormous increase in the amount of unregulated, speculative capital. The figures are really astonishing. John Eatwell, one of the leading specialists in finance at Cambridge University, estimates that, in 1970, about 90% of international capital was used for trade and long-term investment, more or less productive things, and 10% for speculation. By 1990, those figures had reversed, 90% for speculation and 10% for trade and long-term investment. Not only has there been radical change in the nature of unregulated financial capital, but the quantity has grown enormously. According to a recent World Bank estimate, $14 trillion is now moving around the world, about $1 trillion or so of which moves every day. This huge amount of mostly speculative capital creates pressures for deflationary policies, because what speculative capital wants is low growth and low inflation. It's driving much of the world into a low growth, low wage equilibrium. This is a tremendous attack against government efforts to stimulate the economy. Even in the richer societies, it's very difficult. In the poorer societies, it's hopeless. What happened with Clinton's trivial stimulus package was a good indication. It amounted to nothing $19 billion, but it was shot down instantly. In the fall of 1993, the Financial Times, of London, trumpeted, "The public sector is in retreat everywhere." Is that true? It's largely true. But major parts of the public sector are alive and well, in particular those parts that cater to the interests of the wealthy and the powerful. They're declining somewhat, but they're still very lively and they're not going to disappear. These developments have been going on for about 20 years now. They had to do with major changes in the international economy that became more or less crystallized by the early 1970s. For one thing, U.S. economic hegemony over the world had pretty much ended by then, and Europe and Japan had re-emerged as major economic and political powers. The costs of the Vietnam War were very significant for the U.S. economy, and extremely beneficial for its rivals. That tended to shift the world balance. In any event, by the early 1970s, the U.S. felt that it could no longer sustain its traditional role as essentially international banker. This role was codified in the Bretton Woods agreements at the end of the Second World War, in which currencies were regulated relative to one another, and in which the de facto international currency, the U.S. dollar, was fixed to gold. Nixon dismantled the Bretton Woods system around 1970. That led to tremendous growth in unregulated financial capital. That growth was rapidly accelerated by the short-term rise in the price of commodities like oil, which led to a huge flow of petrodollars into the international system. Furthermore, the telecommunications revolution made it extremely easy to transfer capital, or, rather, the electronic equivalent of capital, from one place to another. There's also been a very substantial growth in the internationalization of production. It's now a lot easier than it was to shift production to foreign countries, generally highly repressive ones where you get much cheaper labor. So a corporate executive who lives in Greenwich, Connecticut, and whose corporate and bank headquarters are in New York City can have a factory somewhere in the third world. The actual banking operations can take place in various offshore regions where you don't have to worry about supervision. You can launder drug money or whatever you feel like doing. This has led to a totally different economy. With the pressure on corporate profits that began in the early 1970s, a big attack was launched on the whole social contract that had developed through a century of struggle and that had been more or less codified around the end of the Second World War with the New Deal and the European social welfare states. The attack was led by the US and England, and by now has reached continental Europe. It's led to a serious decline in unionization, which carries with it a decline in wages and other forms of protection, and to a very sharp polarization of the society, primarily in the US and Britain, but it's spreading. Driving in to work this morning, I was listening to the BBC, the British Broadcasting Company, Britain's national broadcasting service. They reported a new study that found that children living in workhouses a century ago had better nutritional standards than millions of poor children in Britain today. That's one of the grand achievements of former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's revolution. She succeeded in devastating British society and destroying large parts of British manufacturing capacity. England is now one of the poorest countries in Europe, not much above Spain and Portugal, and well below Italy. The American achievement was rather similar. We're a much richer, more powerful country, so it isn't possible to achieve quite what Britain achieved. But the Reaganites succeeded in driving U.S. wages down so far that we're now the second lowest of the major industrial countries, barely above Britain. Labor costs in Italy are about 20% higher than in the U.S., and in Germany they're maybe 60% higher. Along with that goes a deterioration of the general social contract and a breakdown of the kind of public spending that benefits the less privileged. Needless to say, the kind of public spending that benefits the wealthy and the privileged, which is enormous, remains fairly stable. Free Trade, my local newspaper, the Boulder, Colorado, Daily Camera, which is part of the Knight Ridder chain, ran a series of questions and answers about GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. They answered the question, who would benefit from a GATT agreement? By writing, consumers would be the big winners. Does that track with your understanding? If they mean rich consumers, yes, they'll gain. But much of the population will see a decline in wages, both in rich countries and poor ones. Take a look at NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, where the analyses have already been done. The day after NAFTA passed, the New York Times had its first article on its expected impact in the New York region. Its conclusions apply to GATT too. It was a very upbeat article. They talked about how wonderful NAFTA was going to be. They said that finance and services will be particularly big winners. Banks, investment firms, PR firms, corporate law firms will do just great. Some manufacturers will also benefit, for example, publishing and the chemical industry, which is highly capital-intensive, with not many workers to worry about. Then they said, well, there'll be some losers too, women, Hispanics, other minorities, and semi-skilled workers, in other words, about 2/3 of the workforce. But everyone else will do fine. Just as anyone who was paying attention knew, the purpose of NAFTA was to create an even smaller sector of highly privileged people, investors, professionals, managerial classes. Bear in mind that this is a rich country, so this privileged sector, although smaller, still isn't tiny. It will work fine for them, and the general population will suffer. The prediction for Mexico is exactly the same. The leading financial journal in Mexico, which is very pro-NAFTA, estimated that Mexico would lose about 25% of its manufacturing capacity in the first few years, and about 15% of its manufacturing labor force. In addition, Cheap U.S. agricultural exports are expected to drive several million people off the land. That's going to mean a substantial increase in the unemployed workforce in Mexico, which of course will drive down wages. On top of that, union organizing is essentially impossible. Corporations can operate internationally, but unions can't, so there's no way for the workforce to fight back against the internationalization of production. The net effect is expected to be a decline in wealth and income for most people in Mexico and for most people in the U.S. The strongest NAFTA advocates point that out in the small print. My colleague at MIT, Paul Krugman, is a specialist in international trade and, interestingly, one of the economists who's done some of the theoretical work showing why free trade doesn't work. He was nevertheless an enthusiastic advocate of NAFTA, which is, I should stress, not a free trade agreement. He agreed with the Times that unskilled workers, about 70% of the workforce, would lose. The Clinton administration has various fantasies about retraining workers, but that would probably have very little impact. In any case, they're doing nothing about it. The same thing is true of skilled white-collar workers. You can get software programmers in India who are very well trained at a fraction of the cost of Americans. Somebody involved in this business recently told me that Indian programmers are actually being brought to the U.S. and put into what are kind of like slave labor camps and kept at Indian salaries, a fraction of American salaries, doing software development. So that kind of work can be farmed out just as easily. The search for profit, when it's unconstrained and free from public control, will naturally try to repress people's lives as much as possible. The executives wouldn't be doing their jobs otherwise. What accounted for all the opposition to NAFTA? The original expectation was that NAFTA would just sail through. Nobody would even know what it was. So it was signed in secret. It was put on a fast track in Congress, meaning essentially no discussion. There was virtually no media coverage. Who was going to know about a complex trade agreement? That didn't work, and there are a number of reasons why it didn't. For one thing, the labor movement got organized for once and made an issue of it. Then there was this sort of maverick third-party candidate, Ross Perot, who managed to make it a public issue. And it turned out that as soon as the public learned anything about NAFTA, they were pretty much opposed. I followed the media coverage on this, which was extremely interesting. Usually the media try to keep their class loyalties more or less in the background. They try to pretend they don't have them. But on this issue, the bars were down. They went berserk, and toward the end, when it looked like NAFTA might not pass, they just turned into raving maniacs. But despite this enormous media barrage and the government attack and huge amounts of corporate lobbying, which totally dwarfed all the other lobbying, of course, the level of opposition remained pretty stable. Roughly 60% or so of those who had an opinion remained opposed. The same sort of media barrage influenced the Gore-Perot television debate. I didn't watch it, but friends who did thought Perot just wiped Gore off the map. But the media proclaimed that Gore won a massive victory. In polls the next day, people were asked what they thought about the debate. The percentage who thought that Perot had been smashed was far higher than the percentage who'd seen the debate, which means that most people were being told what to think by the media, not coming to their own conclusions. Incidentally, what was planned for NAFTA worked for GATT. There was virtually no public opposition to it, or even awareness of it. It was rammed through in secret, as intended. What about the position people like us find ourselves in of being against, of being anti-reactive rather than proactive? NAFTA's a good case, because very few NAFTA critics were opposed to any agreement. Virtually everyone, the labor movement, the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment, a major report that was suppressed, and other critics, including me, was saying there'd be nothing wrong with a North American free trade agreement, but not this one. It should be different, and here are the ways in which it should be different in some detail. Even Perot had constructive proposals. But all that was suppressed. What's left is the picture that, say, Anthony Lewis portrayed in the Times, jingoist fanatics screaming about NAFTA. Incidentally, what's called the left played the same game. James Galbraith is an economist at the University of Texas. He had an article in a sort of left liberal journal, World Policy Review, in which he discussed an article in which I said the opposite of what he attributed to me, of course, but that's typical. Galbraith said there's this jingoist left nationalist fanatics who don't want Mexican workers to improve their lives. Then he went on about how the Mexicans are in favor of NAFTA. True, if by Mexicans you mean Mexican industrialists and executives and corporate lawyers, not Mexican workers and peasants. All the way from people like James Galbraith and Anthony Lewis to way over to the right, you had this very useful fabrication that critics of NAFTA were reactive and negative and jingoist, and against progress and just wanted to go back to old-time protectionism. When you have essentially total control of the information system, it's rather easy to convey that image. But it simply isn't true. Anthony Lewis also wrote, "The engine for the world's growth has been vastly increased international trade." Do you agree? His use of the word trade, while conventional, is misleading. The latest figures available, from about 10 years ago, they're probably higher now, show that about 30% or 40% of what's called world trade is actually internal transfers within a corporation. I believe that about 70% of Japanese exports to the US are intrafirm transfers of this sort. So, for example, Ford Motor Company will have components manufactured here in the US and then ship them for assembly to a plant in Mexico, where the workers get much lower wages and where Ford doesn't have to worry about pollution, unions, and all that nonsense. Then they ship the assembled part back here. About half of what are called U.S. exports to Mexico are intrafirm transfers of this sort. They don't enter the Mexican market, and there's no meaningful sense in which they're exports to Mexico. Still, that's called a trade. The corporations that do this are huge totalitarian institutions, and they aren't governed by market principles. In fact, they promote severe market distortions. For example, a U.S. corporation that has an outlet in Puerto Rico may decide to take its profits in Puerto Rico because of tax rebates. It shifts its prices around, using what's called transfer pricing, so it doesn't seem to be making a profit here. There are estimates of the scale of governmental operations that interfere with trade, but I know of no estimates of internal corporate interferences with market processes. They're no doubt vast in scale, and are sure to be extended by the trade agreements. GATT and NAFTA ought to be called investor rights agreements, not free trade agreements. One of their main purposes is to extend the ability of corporations to carry out market-distorting operations internally. So when people like Clinton's National Security Advisor, Anthony Lake, talk about enlarging market democracy, he's enlarging something, but it's not markets and it's not democracy. Mexico, and South Central LA, I found the mainstream media coverage of Mexico during the NAFTA debate somewhat uneven. The New York Times has allowed in a number of articles that official corruption was, and is, widespread in Mexico. In fact, in one editorial, they virtually conceded that Salinas stole the 1988 presidential election. Why did that information come out? I think it's impossible to repress. Furthermore, there were scattered reports in the Times of popular protest against NAFTA. Tim Golden, their reporter in Mexico, had a story a couple of weeks before the vote, probably in early November 1993, in which he said that lots of Mexican workers were concerned that their wages would decline after NAFTA. Then came the punchline. He said that undercuts the position of people like Ross Perot and others who think that NAFTA is going to harm American workers, for the benefit of Mexican workers. In other words, the fact that they're all going to get screwed was presented as a critique of the people who were opposing NAFTA here. There was very little discussion here of the large-scale popular protest in Mexico, which included, for example, the largest non-governmental trade union. The main trade union is about as independent as the Soviet trade unions were, but there are some independent ones, and they were opposed to the agreement. The environmental movements and most of the other popular movements were opposed. The Mexican Bishops' Conference strongly endorsed the position the Latin American bishops took when they met at Santo Domingo, in the Dominican Republic, in December 1992. That meeting in Santo Domingo was the first major conference of Latin American bishops since the ones at Puebla, Mexico, and Medellin, Colombia, back in the 1960s and 1970s. The Vatican tried to control it this time to make sure that they wouldn't come out with these perverse ideas about liberation theology and the preferential option for the poor. But despite a very firm Vatican hand, the bishops came out quite strongly against neoliberalism and structural adjustment and these free market for the poor policies. That wasn't reported here, to my knowledge. There's been significant union busting in Mexico. Ford and VW are two big examples. A few years ago, Ford simply fired its entire Mexican workforce and would only rehire, at much lower wages, those who agreed not to join a union. Ford was backed in this by the always ruling PRI, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, which has controlled Mexico since the 1920s. VW's case was pretty much the same. They fired workers who supported an independent union and only rehired, at lower wages, those who agreed not to support it. A few weeks after the NAFTA vote in the U.S., workers at a GE and Honeywell plant in Mexico were fired for union activities. I don't know what the final outcome will be, but that's exactly the purpose of things like NAFTA. In early January 1994, you were asked by an editor at the Washington Post to submit an article on the New Year's Day uprising in Chiapas, a state at the southern tip of Mexico, next to Guatemala. Was this the first time the Post had asked you to write something? It was the first time ever. I was kind of surprised, since I'm never asked to write for a national newspaper. So I wrote the article. It was for the Sunday Outlook section, but it didn't appear. Was there an explanation? No. It went to press, as far as I know. The editor who commissioned it called me, apparently after the deadline, to say that it looked okay to him but that it had simply been cancelled at some higher level. I don't know any more about it than that. But I can guess. The article was about Chiapas, but it was also about NAFTA, and I think the Washington Post has been even more extreme than the Times in refusing to allow any discussion of that topic. What happened in Chiapas doesn't come as very much of a surprise. At first, the government thought they'd just destroy the rebellion with tremendous violence, but then they backed off and decided to do it by more subtle violence, when nobody was looking. Part of the reason they backed off is surely their fear that there was just too much sympathy all over Mexico. If they were too upfront about suppression, they'd cause themselves a lot of problems, all the way up to the U.S. border. The Mayan Indians in Chiapas are in many ways the most oppressed people in Mexico. Nevertheless, their problems are shared by a large majority of the Mexican population. This decade of neoliberal reforms has led to very little economic progress in Mexico but has sharply polarized the society. Labor's share in income has declined radically. The number of billionaires has shot up. In that unpublished Post article, you wrote that the protest of the Indian peasants in Chiapas gives only a bare glimpse of time bombs waiting to explode, not only in Mexico. What did you have in mind? Take South Central Los Angeles, for example. In many respects, they are different societies, of course, but there are points of similarity to the Chiapas rebellion. South Central LA is a place where people once had jobs and lives, and those have been destroyed, in large part by the socio-economic processes we've been talking about. For example, furniture factories went to Mexico, where they can pollute more cheaply. Military industry has somewhat declined. People used to have jobs in the steel industry, and they don't anymore. So they rebelled. The Chiapas rebellion was quite different. It was much more organized, and much more constructive. That's the difference between an utterly demoralized society like South Central Los Angeles and one that still retains some sort of integrity and community life. When you look at consumption levels, doubtless the peasants in Chiapas are poorer than people in South Central LA. There are fewer television sets per capita. But by other, more significant criteria, like social cohesion, Chiapas is considerably more advanced. In the U.S., we've succeeded not only in polarizing communities but also in destroying their structures. That's why you have such rampant violence. Haiti, when Aristide won in December 1990, he took office in February 1991, it was a big surprise. He was swept into power by a network of popular grassroots organizations, what was called Lavalas, the flood, which outside observers just weren't aware of, since they don't pay attention to what happens among poor people. There had been very extensive and very successful organizing, and out of nowhere came this massive popular organization that managed to sweep their candidate into power. The U.S. was willing to support a democratic election, figuring that its candidate, a former World Bank official named Mark Bazin, would easily win. He had all the resources and support, and it looked like a shoo-in. He ended up getting 14% of the vote, and Aristide got about 67%. The only question in the mind of anybody who knows a little history should have been, how is the U.S. going to get rid of Aristide? The disaster became even worse in the first 7 months of Aristide's office. There were some really amazing developments. Haiti is, of course, an extremely impoverished country, with awful conditions. Aristide was nevertheless beginning to get places. He was able to reduce corruption extensively, and to trim a highly bloated state bureaucracy. He won a lot of international praise for this, even from the international lending institutions, which were offering him loans and preferential terms because they liked what he was doing. Furthermore, he cut back on drug trafficking. The flow of refugees to the U.S. virtually stopped. Atrocities were reduced to way below what they had been or would become. There was a considerable degree of popular engagement in what was going on, although the contradictions were already beginning to show up, and there were constraints on what he could do. All of this made Aristide even more unacceptable from the U.S. point of view, and we tried to undermine him through what were called, naturally, democracy-enhancing programs. The U.S., which had never cared at all about centralization of power in Haiti when its own favored dictators were in charge, all of a sudden began setting up alternative institutions that aimed at undermining executive power, supposedly in the interests of greater democracy. A number of these alleged human rights and labor groups became the governing authorities after the coup, which came on September 30, 1991. In response to the coup, the Organization of American States declared an embargo of Haiti. The U.S. joined it, but with obvious reluctance. The Bush administration focused attention on Aristide's alleged atrocities and undemocratic activities, downplaying the major atrocities which took place right after the coup. The media went along with Bush's line, of course. While people were getting slaughtered in the streets of Port-au-Prince, Haiti's capital, the media concentrated on alleged human rights abuses under the Aristide government. Refugees started fleeing again, because the situation was deteriorating so rapidly. The Bush administration blocked them, instituted a blockade, in effect, to send them back. Within a couple of months, the Bush administration had already undermined the embargo by allowing a minor exception. U.S.-owned companies would be permitted to ignore it. The New York Times called that fine-tuning the embargo to improve the restoration of democracy. Meanwhile, the U.S., which is known to be able to exert pressure when it feels like it, found no way to influence anyone else to observe the embargo, including the Dominican Republic next door. The whole thing was mostly a farce. Pretty soon Mark Bazin, the U.S. candidate, was in power as Prime Minister, with the ruling generals behind him. That year, 1992, U.S. trade with Haiti was not very much below the norm, despite the so-called embargo. Commerce Department figures showed that, but I don't think the press ever reported it. During the 1992 campaign, Clinton bitterly attacked the Bush administration for its inhuman policy of returning refugees to this torture chamber, which is, incidentally, a flat violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we claim to uphold. Clinton claimed he was going to change all that, but his first act after being elected, even before he took office, was to impose even harsher measures to force fleeing refugees back into this hellhole. Ever since then, it's simply been a matter of seeing what kind of finessing will be carried out to ensure that Haiti's popularly elected government doesn't come back into office. It doesn't have much longer to run. The next elections are scheduled for December 1995, so the U.S. has more or less won that game. Meanwhile, the terror and atrocities increase. The popular organizations are getting decimated. Although the so-called embargo is still in place, U.S. trade continues and, in fact, went up about 50% under Clinton. Haiti, a starving island, is exporting food to the U.S., about 35 times as much under Clinton as it did under Bush. Baseballs are coming along nicely. They're produced in U.S.-owned factories where the women who make them get 10 cents an hour, if they meet their quota. Since meeting the quota is virtually impossible, they actually make something like 5 cents an hour. Softballs from Haiti are advertised in the U.S. as being unusually good because they're hand-dipped into some chemical that makes them hang together properly. The ads don't mention that the chemical the women hand-dip the balls into is toxic and that, as a result, the women don't last very long at this work. In his exile, Aristide has been asked to make concessions to the military junta and to the right-wing business community. That's kind of curious. For the victim, the aggrieved party, to make concessions to his victimizer. It's perfectly understandable. The Aristide government had entirely the wrong base of support. The U.S. has tried for a long time to get him to broaden his government in the interests of democracy. This means throw out the 2/3 of the population that voted for him and bring in what are called moderate Elements of the business community, the local owners or managers of those textile and baseball producing plants, and those who are linked up with U.S. agribusiness. When they're not in power, it's not democratic. The extremist elements of the business community think you ought to just slaughter everybody and cut them to pieces and hack off their faces, and leave them in ditches. The moderates think you ought to have them working in your assembly plants for 14 cents an hour under indescribable conditions. Bring the moderates in and give them power, and then we'll have a real democracy. Unfortunately, Aristide, being kind of backward and disruptive, has not been willing to go along with that. Clinton's policy has gotten so cynical and outrageous that he's lost almost all major domestic support on it. Even the mainstream press is denouncing him at this point. So there will have to be some cosmetic changes made. But unless there's an awful lot of popular pressure, our policies will continue, and pretty soon we'll have the moderates in power. Let's say Aristide is restored. Given the destruction of popular organizations and the devastation of civil society, what are his and the country's prospects? Some of the closest observation of this has been done by America's Watch, a US-based human rights monitoring organization. They gave an answer to that question that I thought was plausible. In early 1993, they said that things were reaching the point that even if Aristide were restored, the lively, vibrant civil society based on grassroots organizations that had brought him to power would have been so decimated that it's unlikely that he'd have the popular support to do anything anyway. I don't know if that's true or not. Nobody knows, any more than anyone knew how powerful those groups were in the first place. Human beings have reserves of courage that are often hard to imagine. But I think that's the plan, to decimate the organizations, to intimidate people so much that it won't matter if you have democratic elections. There was an interesting conference run by the Jesuits in El Salvador several months before the Salvadoran elections. Its final report came out in January 1994. They were talking about the build-up to the elections and the ongoing terror, which was substantial. They said that the long-term effect of terror, something they've had plenty of experience with, is to domesticate people's aspirations, to make them think there's no alternative, to drive out any hope. Once you've done that, you can have elections without too much fear. If people are sufficiently intimidated, if the popular organizations are sufficiently destroyed, if the people have had it beaten into their heads that either they accept the rule of those with the guns or else they live and die in unrelieved misery, then your elections will all come out the way you want. And everybody will cheer. Cuban refugees are considered political and are accepted immediately into the U.S., while Haitian refugees are termed economic and are refused entry. If you look at the records, many Haitians who are refused asylum in the U.S. because they aren't considered to be political refugees, are found a few days later hacked to pieces in the streets of Haiti. There were a couple of interesting leaks from the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service. One was from an INS officer who'd been working in our embassy in Port-au-Prince. In an interview with Dennis Bernstein of KPFA, a listener-supported radio station in Berkeley, California, he described in detail how they weren't even making the most perfunctory efforts to check the credentials of people who were applying for political asylum. At about the same time, a document was leaked from the U.S. Interests section in Havana, which reviews applications for asylum in the U.S., in which they complain that they can't find genuine political asylum cases. The applicants they get can't really claim any serious persecution. At most they claim various kinds of harassment, which aren't enough to qualify them. So, there are the two cases, side by side. I should mention that the U.S. Justice Department has just made a slight change in U.S. law, which makes our violation of international law and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights even more grotesque. Now Haitian refugees who, by some miracle, reach U.S. territorial waters can be shipped back. That's never been allowed before. I doubt that many other countries allow that. Nicaragua, Reagan and Kirkpatrick were talking about an incident in which, according to America's Watch, several dozen mosquitoes were killed and a lot of people were forcefully moved in a rather ugly way in the course of the Contra War. The U.S. terrorist forces were moving into the area and this was the Sandinistas' reaction. It was certainly an atrocity, but it's not even visible compared to the ones Jeane Kirkpatrick was celebrating in the neighboring countries at the time, and in Nicaragua, where the overwhelming mass of the atrocities were committed by the so-called freedom fighters. What's happening to the mosquitoes now? When I was in Nicaragua in October 1993, church sources, the Christian Evangelical Church, primarily, which works in the Atlantic coast, were reporting that 100,000 mosquitoes were starving to death as a result of the policies we were imposing on Nicaragua. Not a word about it in the media here. More recently, it did get some slight reporting. People here are worrying about the fact that one typical consequence of U.S. victories in the Third World is that the countries where we win immediately become big centers for drug flow. There are good reasons for that. It's part of the market system we impose on them. Nicaragua has become a major drug transshipment center. A lot of the drugs go through the Atlantic coast, now that Nicaragua's whole governmental system has collapsed. Drug transshipment areas usually breed major drug epidemics, and there's one among the mosquitoes, primarily among the men who dive for lobsters and other shellfish. Both in Nicaragua and Honduras, these mosquito Indian divers are compelled by economic circumstances to do very deep diving without equipment. Their brains get smashed and they quickly die. In order to try to maintain their work rate, the divers stuff themselves with cocaine. It helps them bear the pain. There's concern about drugs here, so that story got into the press. But of course, nobody cares much about the working conditions. After all, it's a standard free market technique. You've got plenty of superfluous people, so you make them work under horrendous conditions. When they die, you just bring in others. China, right in the midst of that summit, a little tiny report appeared in the papers. In booming Guangdong province, the economic miracle of China, 81 women were burned to death because they were locked into a factory. A couple of weeks later, 60 workers were killed in a Hong Kong-owned factory. China's Labor Ministry reported that 11,000 workers had been killed in industrial accidents just in the first 8 months of 1993, twice as many as in the preceding year. These sort of practices never enter the human rights debate, but there's been a big hullabaloo about the use of prison labor. Front-page stories in the Times. What's the difference? Very simple. Because prison labor is state enterprise, it doesn't contribute to private profit. In fact, it undermines private profit because it competes with private industry. But locking women into factories where they burn to death contributes to private profit. So prison labor is a human rights violation, but there's no right not to be burned to death. We have to maximize profit. From that principle, everything follows. Russia, Yeltsin was the tough, autocratic Communist Party boss of Sverdlovsk. He's filled his administration with the old party hacks who ran for him under the earlier Soviet system. The West likes him a lot because he's ruthless and because he's willing to ram through what are called reforms, a nice-sounding word. These reforms are designed to return the former Soviet Union to the Third World status it had for the 500 years before the Bolshevik Revolution. The Cold War was largely about the demand that this huge region of the world once again become what it had been, an area of resources, markets, and cheap labor for the West. Yeltsin is leading the pack on pushing the reforms. Therefore he's a Democrat. That's what we call a Democrat anywhere in the world, someone who follows the Western business agenda. Dead children and debt service. After you returned from a recent trip to Nicaragua, you told me that it's becoming more difficult to tell the difference between economists and Nazi doctors. What did you mean by that? There's a report from UNESCO, which I didn't see reported in the US media, that estimated the human cost of the reforms aiming to return Eastern Europe to its Third World status. UNESCO estimates that about 500,000 deaths a year in Russia since 1989 are the direct result of the reforms, caused by the collapse of health services, the increase in disease, the rise in malnutrition, and so on. Killing 500,000 people a year, that's a fairly substantial achievement for reformers. The figures are similar, but not quite as bad, in the rest of Eastern Europe. In the Third World, the numbers are fantastic. For example, another UNESCO report estimated that about 500,000 children in Africa die every year simply from debt service. Not from the whole array of reforms, just from interest on their country's debts. It's estimated that about 11 million children die every year from easily curable diseases, most of which could be overcome by treatments that cost a couple of cents. But the economists tell us that to do this would be interference with the market system. There's nothing new about this. It's very reminiscent of the British economists who, during the Irish potato famine in the mid-19th century, dictated that Ireland must export food to Britain, which it did right through the famine, and that it shouldn't be given food aid because that would violate the sacred principles of political economy. These policies always happen to have the curious property of benefiting the wealthy and harming the poor. Historical background: how the Nazis won the war. In his book A Blowback, Chris Simpson described Operation Paperclip, which involved the importation of a large number of known Nazi war criminals, rocket scientists, camp guards, etc. There was also an operation involving the Vatican, the U.S. State Department, and British intelligence, which took some of the worst Nazi criminals and used them, initially in Europe. For example, Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, France, was taken over by U.S. intelligence and put back to work. Later, when this became an issue, some of his U.S. supervisors didn't understand what the fuss was all about. After all, we'd moved in, we'd replaced the Germans. We needed a person who would attack the left-wing resistance, and here was a specialist. That's what he'd been doing for the Nazis, so who better could we find to do exactly the same job for us? When the Americans could no longer protect Barbie, they moved him over to the Vatican-run Oratlin, where Croatian Nazi priests and others managed to spirit him off to Latin America. There he continued his career. He became a prominent drug lord and narco-trafficker and was involved in a military coup in Bolivia, all with U.S. support. But Barbie was basically small potatoes. This was a significant operation, involving many top Nazis. We managed to get Walter Roff, the man who created the gas chambers, off to Chile. Others went to fascist Spain. General Reinhard Gehlen was the head of German military intelligence on the Eastern Front. That's where the real war crimes were committed. Now we're talking about Auschwitz and other death camps. Gehlen and his network of spies and terrorists were taken over quickly by American intelligence and returned to essentially the same roles. If you look at the American Army's counterinsurgency literature, much of which is now declassified, it begins with an analysis of the German experience in Europe, written with the cooperation of Nazi officers. Everything is described from the perspective of the Nazis: what techniques for controlling resistance worked, which ones didn't. With barely any changes, that was transmuted into American counterinsurgency literature. This is discussed at some length by Michael McClintock in Instruments of Statecraft, a very good book that I've never seen reviewed. The U.S. left behind armies that the Nazis had established in Eastern Europe, and continued to support them at least into the early 1950s. By then, the Russians had penetrated American intelligence, so the airdrops didn't work very well anymore. You've said that if a genuine post-World War II history were ever written, this would be the first chapter. It would be a part of the first chapter. Recruiting Nazi war criminals and saving them is bad enough, but imitating their activities is worse. So the first chapter would primarily describe U.S., and some British, operations throughout the world that aimed to destroy the anti-fascist resistance and restore the traditional, essentially fascist, order to power. I've also discussed this in an earlier book in this series, What Uncle Sam Really Wants. In Korea, where we ran the operation alone, restoring the traditional order meant killing about 100,000 people just in the late 1940s, before the Korean War began. In Greece, it meant destroying the peasant and worker base of the anti-Nazi resistance and restoring Nazi collaborators to power. When British and then American troops moved into southern Italy, they simply reinstated the fascist order, the industrialists. But the significant problem came when the troops got to the north, which the Italian resistance had already liberated. The place was functioning. The industry was running. We had to dismantle all of that and restore the old order. Our big criticism of the resistance was that they were displacing the old owners in favor of workers and community control. Britain and the U.S. called this arbitrary replacement of the legitimate owners. The resistance was also giving jobs to more people than were strictly needed for the greatest economic efficiency, that is, for maximum profit-making. We called this hiring excess workers. In other words, the resistance was trying to democratize the workplace and to take care of the population. That was understandable, since many Italians were starving. But starving people were their problem. Our problem was to eliminate the hiring of excess workers and the arbitrary dismissal of owners, which we did. Next, we worked on destroying the democratic process. The left was obviously going to win the elections. It had a lot of prestige from the resistance, and the traditional conservative order had been discredited. The U.S. wouldn't tolerate that. At its first meeting, in 1947, the National Security Council decided to withhold food and use other sorts of pressure to undermine the election. But what if the communists still won? In its first report, NSC 1, the Council made plans for that contingency. The U.S. would declare a national emergency, put the Sixth Fleet on alert in the Mediterranean, and support paramilitary activities to overthrow the Italian government. That's a pattern that's been relived over and over. If you look at France and Germany and Japan, you get pretty much the same story. Nicaragua is another case. You strangle them, you starve them, and then you have an election and everybody talks about how wonderful democracy is. The person who opened up this topic, as he did many others, was Gabriel Calco, in his classic book, Politics of War, in 1968. It was mostly ignored, but it's a terrific piece of work. A lot of the documents weren't around then, but his picture turns out to be quite accurate. Richard Nixon's death generated much fanfare. Henry Kissinger said in his eulogy, "The world is a better place, a safer place, because of Richard Nixon." I'm sure he was thinking of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. But let's focus on one place that wasn't mentioned in all the media hoopla, Chile, and see how it's a better, safer place. In early September 1970, Salvador Allende was elected president of Chile in a democratic election. What were his politics? He was basically a social democrat, very much of the European type. He was calling for minor redistribution of wealth, to help the poor. Chile was a very inegalitarian society. Allende was a doctor, and one of the things he did was to institute a free milk program for 500,000 very poor, malnourished children. He called for nationalization of major industries like copper mining, and for a policy of international independence, meaning that Chile wouldn't simply subordinate itself to the US but would take a more independent path. Was the election he won free and democratic? Not entirely, because there were major efforts to disrupt it, mainly by the US. It wasn't the first time the US had done that. For example, our government intervened massively to prevent Allende from winning the preceding election in 1964. In fact, when the Church Committee investigated years later, they discovered that the U.S. spent more money per capita to get the candidate it favored elected in Chile in 1964 than was spent by both candidates, Johnson and Goldwater, in the 1964 election in the U.S. Similar measures were undertaken in 1970 to try to prevent a free and democratic election. There was a huge amount of black propaganda about how if Allende won, mothers would be sending their children off to Russia to become slaves, stuff like that. The U.S. also threatened to destroy the economy, which it could, and did, do. Nevertheless, Allende won. A few days after his victory, Nixon called in CIA Director Richard Helms, Kissinger, and others for a meeting on Chile. Can you describe what happened? As Helms reported in his notes, there were 2 points of view. The soft line was, in Nixon's words, to make the economy scream. The hard line was simply to aim for a military coup. Our ambassador to Chile, Edward Corey, who was a Kennedy liberal type, was given the job of implementing the soft line. Here's how he described his task: to do all within our power to condemn Chile and the Chileans to utmost deprivation and poverty. That was the soft line. There was a massive destabilization and disinformation campaign. The CIA planted stories in El Mercurio, Chile's most prominent paper, and fomented labor unrest and strikes. They really pulled out all the stops on this one. Later, when the military coup finally came, in September 1973, and the government was overthrown, and thousands of people were being imprisoned, tortured, and slaughtered, the economic aid which had been cancelled immediately began to flow again. As a reward for the military junta's achievement in reversing Chilean democracy, the U.S. gave massive support to the new government. Our ambassador to Chile brought up the question of torture to Kissinger. Kissinger rebuked him sharply, saying something like, "Don't give me any of those political science lectures. We don't care about torture, we care about important things." Then he explained what the important things were. Kissinger said he was concerned that the success of social democracy in Chile would be contagious. It would infect Southern Europe, Southern Italy, for example, and would lead to the possible success of what was then called Eurocommunism, meaning that communist parties would hook up with social democratic parties in a united front. Actually, the Kremlin was just as much opposed to Eurocommunism as Kissinger was, But this gives you a very clear picture of what the domino theory is all about. Even Kissinger, mad as he is, didn't believe that Chilean armies were going to descend on Rome. It wasn't going to be that kind of influence. He was worried that successful economic development, where the economy produces benefits for the general population, not just profits for private corporations, would have a contagious effect. In those comments, Kissinger revealed the basic story of U.S. foreign policy for decades. You see that pattern repeating itself in Nicaragua in the 1980s. Everywhere. The same was true in Vietnam, in Cuba, in Guatemala, in Greece. That's always the worry, the threat of a good example. Kissinger also said, again speaking about Chile, "I don't see why we should have to stand by and let a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its own people." As The Economist put it, we should make sure that policy is insulated from politics. If people are irresponsible, they should just be cut out of the system. In recent years, Chile's economic growth rate has been heralded in the press. Chile's economy isn't doing badly, but it's based almost entirely on exports, fruit, copper, and so on, and thus is very vulnerable to world markets. There was a really funny pair of stories yesterday. The New York Times had one about how everyone in Chile is so happy and satisfied with the political system that nobody's paying much attention to the upcoming election. But the London Financial Times, which is the world's most influential business paper and hardly radical, took exactly the opposite tack. They cited polls that showed that 75% of the population was very disgruntled with the political system, which allows no options. There is indeed apathy about the election, but that's a reflection of the breakdown of Chile's social structure. Chile was a very vibrant, lively, democratic society for many, many years, into the early 1970s. Then, through a reign of fascist terror, it was essentially depoliticized. The breakdown of social relations is pretty striking. People work alone and just try to fend for themselves. The retreat into individualism and personal gain is the basis for the political apathy. Nathaniel Nash wrote the Times Chile story. He said that many Chileans have painful memories of Salvador Allende's fiery speeches, which led to the coup in which thousands of people were killed, including Allende. Notice that they don't have painful memories of the torture, of the fascist terror, just of Allende's speeches as a popular candidate. Cambodia. Would you talk a little about the notion of unworthy versus worthy victims? New York Newsday columnist and former New York Times reporter, Sidney Schanberg wrote an op-ed piece in the Boston Globe in which he blasted Senator Kerry of Massachusetts for being two-faced, because Kerry refused to concede that the Vietnamese have not been entirely forthcoming about American POWs. Nobody, according to Schanberg, is willing to tell the truth about this. He says the government ought to finally have the honesty to say that it left Indochina without accounting for all the Americans. Of course, it wouldn't occur to him to suggest that the government should be honest enough to say that we killed a couple of million people and destroyed 3 countries and left them in total wreckage and have been strangling them ever since. It's particularly striking that this is Sidney Schanberg, a person of utter depravity. He's regarded as the great conscience of the press because of his courage in exposing the crimes of our official enemies, namely, Pol Pot, leader of Cambodia's Khmer Rouge rebel army. He also happened to be the main U.S. reporter in Phnom Penh, Cambodia's capital, in 1973. This was at the peak of the U.S. bombardment of inner Cambodia, when hundreds of thousands of people, according to the best estimates, were being killed and the society was being wiped out. Nobody knows very much about the bombing campaign and its effects because people like Sidney Schanberg refused to cover it. It wouldn't have been hard for him to cover it. He wouldn't have to go trekking off into the jungle. He could walk across the street from his fancy hotel in Phnom Penh and talk to any of the hundreds of thousands of refugees who'd been driven from the countryside into the city. I went through all of his reporting. It's reviewed in detail in Manufacturing Consent, my book with Edward Herman, currently editor of Lies of Our Times. You'll find a few scattered sentences here and there about the bombing, but not a single interview with the refugees. There is one American atrocity he did report, for about 3 days, The Killing Fields, the movie that's based on his story, opens by describing it. What's the one report? American planes hit the wrong village, a government village. That's an atrocity that he covered. How about when they hit the right village? We don't care about that. Incidentally, the United States' own record with POWs has been atrocious, not only in Vietnam, where it was monstrous, but in Korea, where it was even worse. And after WW2, we kept POWs illegally under confinement, as did the British. World War II POWs. Other losses. A Canadian book alleges it was official U.S. policy to withhold food from German prisoners in World War II. Many of them supposedly starved to death. That's James Back's book. There's been a lot of controversy about the details, and I'm not sure what the facts of the matter are. On the other hand, there are things about which there's no controversy. Ed Herman and I wrote about them back in the late 1970s. Basically, the Americans ran what were called re-education camps for German POWs. The name was ultimately changed to something equally Orwellian. These camps were hailed as a tremendous example of our humanitarianism because we were teaching the prisoners democratic ways. In other words, we were indoctrinating them into accepting our beliefs. The prisoners were treated very brutally, starved, etc. Since these camps were in gross violation of international conventions, they were kept secret. We were afraid that the Germans might retaliate and treat American prisoners the same way. Furthermore, the camps continued after the war, I forget for how long, but I think the U.S. kept German POWs until mid-1946. They were used for forced labor, beaten, and killed. It was even worse in England. They kept their German POWs until mid-1948. It was all totally illegal. Finally, there was public reaction in Britain. The person who started it off was Peggy Duff, a marvelous woman who died a couple of years ago. She was later one of the leading figures in the CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and the international peace movement during the 1960s and 1970s, but she started off her career with a protest against the treatment of German POWs. Incidentally, why only German POWs? What about the Italians? Germany's a very efficient country, so they've published volumes of documents on what happened to their POWs. But Italy's sort of laid back, so there was no research on their POWs. We don't know anything about them, although they were surely treated much worse. When I was a kid, there was a POW camp right next to my high school. There were conflicts among the students over the issue of taunting the prisoners. The students couldn't physically attack the prisoners, because they were behind a barrier, but they threw things at them and taunted them. There were a group of us who thought this was horrifying and objected to it, but there weren't many. Miscellaneous topics. Consumption versus well-being. The United States, with 5% of the world's population, consumes 40% of the world's resources. You don't have to be a genius to figure out what that's leading to. For one thing, a lot of that consumption is artificially induced. It doesn't have to do with people's real wants and needs. People would probably be better off and happier if they didn't have a lot of those things. If you measure economic health by profits, then such consumption is healthy. If you measure the consumption by what it means to people, it's very unhealthy, particularly in the long term. A huge amount of business propaganda, that is, the output of the public relations and advertising industry, is simply an effort to create wants. This has been well understood for a long time. In fact, it goes back to the early days of the Industrial Revolution. For another thing, those who have more money tend to consume more, for obvious reasons. So consumption is skewed towards luxuries for the wealthy rather than towards necessities for the poor. That's true within the US and on a global scale as well. The richer countries are the higher consumers by a large measure, and within the richer countries, the wealthy are higher consumers by a large measure. Cooperative enterprises. There's a social experiment in Mondragon in the Basque region of Spain. Can you describe it? Mondragon is basically a very large worker-owned cooperative with many different industries in it, including some fairly sophisticated manufacturing. It's economically quite successful, but since it's inserted into a capitalist economy, it's no more committed to sustainable growth than any other part of the capitalist economy is. Internally, it's not worker-controlled, it's manager-controlled. So it's a mixture of what's sometimes called industrial democracy, which means ownership, at least in principle, by the workforce, along with elements of hierarchic domination and control, as opposed to worker management. I mentioned earlier that businesses are about as close to strict totalitarian structures as any human institutions are. Something like Mondragon is considerably less so. The coming eco-catastrophe. Radio listener, what's happening in the growing economies in Southeast Asia, China, etc.? Is it going to be another example of capitalist exploitation, or can we expect to see some kind of change in their awareness? Right now, it's catastrophic. In countries like Thailand or China, ecological catastrophes are looming. These are countries where growth is being fueled by multinational investors for whom the environment is what's called an externality, which means you don't pay any attention to it. So if you destroy the forests in Thailand, say, that's okay as long as you make a short-term profit out of it. In China, the disasters which lie not too far ahead could be extraordinary simply because of the country's size. The same is true throughout Southeast Asia. But when the environmental pressures become such that the very survival of people is jeopardized, do you see any change in the actions? Not unless people react. If power is left in the hands of transnational investors, the people will just die. Nuclear power. At a conference in Washington, D.C., a woman in the audience got up and decried the fact that you're in favor of nuclear power. Are you? No, I don't think anybody's in favor of nuclear power, even business, because it's too expensive. But what I am in favor of is being rational on the topic. That means recognizing that the question of nuclear power isn't a moral one, it's a technical one. You have to ask what the consequences of nuclear power are versus the alternatives. There's a range of other alternatives, including conservation, solar, and so on. Each has its advantages and disadvantages. But imagine that the only alternatives were hydrocarbons and nuclear power. If you had to have one or the other, you'd have to ask yourself which is more dangerous to the environment, to human life, to human society. It's not an entirely simple question. For example, suppose that fusion were a feasible alternative. It could turn out to be non-polluting. But there are also negative factors. Any form of nuclear power involves quite serious problems of radioactive waste disposal and can also contribute to nuclear weapons proliferation. Fusion would require a high degree of centralization of state power too. On the other hand, the hydrocarbon industry, which is highly polluting, also promotes centralization. The energy corporations are some of the biggest in the world, and the Pentagon system is constructed to a significant degree to maintain their power. In other words, there are questions that have to be thought through. They're not simple. The family. You've suggested that, to further democracy, people should be seeking out authoritarian structures and challenging them, eliminating any form of absolute power and hierarchic power. How would that work in a family structure? In any structure, including a family structure, there are various forms of authority. A patriarchal family may have very rigid authority, with the father setting rules that others adhere to, and in some cases even administering severe punishment if there's a violation of them. There are other hierarchical relations among siblings, between the mother and father, gender relations, and so on. These all have to be questioned. Sometimes I think you'll find that there's a legitimate claim to authority, that is, the challenge to authority can sometimes be met. But the burden of proof is always on the authority. So, for example, some form of control over children is justified. It's fair to prevent a child from putting his or her hand in the oven, say, or from running across the street in traffic. It's proper to place clear bounds on children. They want to understand where they are in the world. However, all of these things have to be done with sensitivity and with self-awareness and with the recognition that any authoritarian role requires justification. It's never self-justifying. When does a child get to the point where the parent doesn't need to provide authority? I don't think there are formulas for this. For one thing, we don't have solid scientific knowledge and understanding of these things. A mixture of experience and intuition, plus a certain amount of study, yields a limited framework of understanding, about which people may certainly differ. And there are also plenty of individual differences. So I don't think there's a simple answer to that question. The growth of autonomy and self-control, and the expansion of the range of legitimate choices, and the ability to exercise them, that's growing up. What you can do. Radio listener, taking it down to the individual, personal level, I got a notice in my public service bill that said they're asking for a rate hike. I work, and I really don't have the time to sit down and write a letter of protest. This happens all the time, and not just with me. Most people don't have time to be active politically to change something. So those rate hikes go through without anybody ever really pointing out what's going on. I've often wondered why there isn't a limitation on the amount of profit any business can make. I know this probably isn't democratic. I think it's highly democratic. There's nothing in the principle of democracy that says that power and wealth should be so highly concentrated that democracy becomes a sham. But your first point is quite correct. If you're a working person, you just don't have time, alone, to take on the power company. That's exactly what organization is about. That's exactly what unions are for, and political parties that are based on working people. If such a party were around, they'd be the ones speaking up for you and telling the truth about what's going on with the rate hike. Then they'd be denounced by the Anthony Lewises of the world for being anti-democratic, in other words, for representing popular interests rather than power interests. Radio listener, I'm afraid there may be a saturation point of despair just from knowing the heaviness of the truth that you impart. I'd like to strongly lobby you to begin devoting maybe 10% or 15% of your appearances or books or articles towards tangible, detailed things that people can do to try to change the world. I've heard a few occasions where someone asks you that question, and your response is, organize. Just do it. I try to keep it in the back of my mind and think about it, but I'm afraid that the answer is always the same. There is only one way to deal with these things. Being alone, you can't do anything. All you can do is deplore the situation. But if you join with other people, you can make changes. Millions of things are possible, depending on where you want to put your efforts. To help you get started, Odonian Press has put together a list of 144 organizations that work to make the world a better place. It begins on the next page. You may also find a couple of current books useful. Howard Zinn's You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train, Beacon, 1994, is well written, as always, and has an optimistic message. Michael Albert's Stop the Killing Train, Radical Visions for Radical Change, South End, 1993, is also forward-looking and constructive. Noam Chomsky.